A faithful wife uncovers a shocking secret when cleaning her husband's study. Moments later, he returns from work and everything changes. Eleanor had always considered herself fortunate. Her life with Harold, her husband of 35 years, was a tapestry of comfort, familiarity, and shared memories. Their marriage, the envy of many, seemed destined for quiet, predictable happiness. The kind of love people admired from afar, envied even. They had raised 2 children, built a home, and with the kids grown and settled they had entered the golden years of their marriage, free from the stress of parenthood, focused on each other. Eleanor always believed that the foundation of their life together was built on trust and honesty. It wasn't a perfect marriage, of course, but they had found their rhythm. Harold, with his sharp wit and easy charm, had been her constant companion, her partner in every sense. They had weathered the highs and lows of life side by side, finding joy in the mundane. Weekend walks in the park, evenings spent reading or watching old movies, the small gestures that reminded them both of the love they had nurtured over the years. For Eleanor, life had been a steady golden stream. On that Saturday afternoon in late October, Eleanor had decided it was time to tackle an overdue task. The house, though always neat, had accumulated its usual clutter, papers here, books there, and the study, Harold's private sanctuary, was no exception. It wasn't that she disliked the space. On the contrary, the study had always felt like the heart of their home, shelves stacked with leather-bound books, family photographs lining the walls, and the soft scent of old paper filling the air. But Harold often retreated to his study alone, and Eleanor had always respected his need for quiet solitude. She wasn't used to disturbing his personal space. Today, however, the weight of the stillness in the house made her restless, and she decided it was time to tidy up. As she sorted through the scattered papers on Harold's desk, a small envelope slipped from between 2 old books. It was thin, unmarked, and completely out of place. Eleanor paused, a strange sensation of foreboding creeping up her spine. It was addressed simply to Harold, no last name, no return address. The handwriting was neat, almost delicate, and the paper was slightly yellowed with age. She hesitated, staring at the envelope as if it were some kind of puzzle she wasn't ready to solve. Eleanor had never been the type to pry into Harold's private life. They had an unspoken agreement over the years, respecting each other's boundaries, keeping their secrets safe. Yet, in that moment, as she held the envelope in her trembling hands, something inside her shifted. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that there were things she didn't know, or maybe it was the stillness of the house, the unsettling quiet that enveloped her, making her feel like the walls were closing in. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, feeling a cold knot form in her stomach. The letter was short but unmistakably intimate. The words were direct, raw, and emotional. As Eleanor scanned the letter, the room seemed to fall away. It was as if time itself had stopped. The letter was dated November 3, 1990, a summer afternoon Harold and Eleanor had spent celebrating their wedding anniversary. She had been blissfully unaware of anything amiss that day. "Harold, I can't help but remember the afternoon we spent in the garden last summer. You've never known how much that meant to me, but I think you do now. I'll be waiting for your call as always. Please don't let this be the last time, Margaret." The words burned through her like a hot iron. Eleanor's heart slammed in her chest, her breath hitching as she reread the letter. It was so simple, so innocuous on the surface, but beneath that, Eleanor could feel the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. The letter spoke of longing, of connection, of a relationship that existed outside of their marriage, and the name that repeated itself in the letter, Margaret. This woman, whoever she was, had a place in Harold's life that Eleanor had never known. Her hands shook as she folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, but the damage had already been done. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the envelope, her thoughts spiraling in confusion and disbelief. How could Harold have kept this from her for so long? How could she have been so blind? Her mind raced through the years searching for signs, any small clue that might have hinted at this betrayal. But all she could see now were shadows, things that seemed insignificant at the time, but now felt ominous and strange. A sudden work trip that Harold had taken 2 years ago, a few unexplained absences that he had brushed off with vague explanations. But no, nothing could have prepared her for this. The sound of Harold's footsteps in the hallway jolted her from her thoughts. He was home early. She quickly shoved the envelope into the back of the drawer, trying to steady her breathing. The air seemed thick, heavy, as though everything in the house had changed in that moment. When Harold entered the study, he paused, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the sight of Eleanor standing beside his desk, her expression unreadable. "Is everything okay, Eleanor?" Harold's voice was casual, almost too casual, as if nothing had happened. He didn't notice the tension in the air, didn't sense the change that had overtaken her. Or maybe he did, maybe he was pretending not to. Eleanor met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to say something, to confront him with the questions swirling in her mind, but her throat went dry. It was as though she had forgotten how to speak. How do you even begin to ask the questions that were now haunting her? How do you confront the man you thought you knew with the betrayal that lurked in his past? Harold, she finally managed to say, her voice tight. Who is Margaret? The question hung in the air like a stone, heavy and impossible to ignore. Harold's face changed. It wasn't a look of surprise or guilt, but something far more unsettling. Evasion. He seemed to hesitate, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, and Eleanor could see the walls going up in his eyes, shutting her out. Margaret, it's nothing, Eleanor, Harold said, his voice suddenly soft, almost apologetic. It was a long time ago. A brief connection. It meant nothing, you know that. But Eleanor's stomach twisted. She didn't believe him, not anymore. What kind of nothing was it, Harold? She demanded, stepping closer. Why didn't you ever tell me about her? Why is this the first time I'm hearing her name? Harold's expression shifted, but this time it wasn't guilt. It was frustration. Eleanor, please, you're overreacting. It was a mistake. A fleeting thing, a memory from another time. I never meant for it to be anything. It's in the past. But Eleanor couldn't shake the image of that letter, those words. She could see now that her marriage had been built on more than just love. It had been built on trust, and that trust had just been shattered. Don't tell me to calm down, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. You owe me more than that. You owe me the truth. Harold ran a hand through his graying hair. He looked worn, tired, and suddenly older. I've told you everything, he said, his tone sharp. I don't have anything more to say about it. But Eleanor wasn't convinced. The silence that followed felt suffocating. A part of her wanted to reach out to him, to smooth things over, to pretend nothing had changed. But she couldn't, not anymore. The life they had built together, the golden life, had cracked, and Eleanor wasn't sure if it could ever be mended. As Harold left the study, Eleanor stood alone, the weight of the letter still heavy in her hands, the truth beginning to settle in her chest. Their perfect marriage, the one she had so carefully curated in her mind, was no longer what it seemed, and the road ahead was filled with uncertainty. The days that followed felt like a fog had descended over Eleanor's life. She moved through them mechanically, performing the daily tasks she had done 1,000 times before, making coffee, folding laundry, preparing meals. But everything felt distant, as though the world had shifted just out of reach. Harold, ever the master of deflection, acted as though nothing had changed. He went about his routines, his smiles a little more forced, his gestures a bit more hurried. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been lost, irreparably so. She couldn't stop thinking about the letter, about Margaret. Her mind replayed those words, the ones that had stabbed at her heart with a brutal clarity. I'll be waiting for your call as always. What did that mean, as always? How many times had Harold spoken those words to Margaret? How many times had he hidden this other world from her? It wasn't just the letter that gnawed at her. It was the silence that followed Harold's admission. When he had first mentioned Margaret, he had painted their relationship as a fleeting, inconsequential moment from the past. But something about his demeanor had unsettled her. The way his eyes avoided hers when he spoke, the way he hurried to brush aside her questions. It wasn't just guilt she saw in him. It was fear. And that fear, like a thread pulled taut, had unraveled Eleanor's sense of security. For years, Eleanor had been able to look at her life with a sense of certainty. Her marriage to Harold had been the foundation of everything. Her identity, her confidence, even her sense of happiness. She had trusted him in ways that went beyond affection. She had trusted him with the deepest parts of herself, believing that the life they had built was solid, unshakable. But now, every piece of that life seemed in jeopardy. Each word Harold spoke felt like a lie wrapped in a half-truth, and Eleanor couldn't ignore the small but growing panic inside her. The next morning, after another hollow breakfast where they both sat in silence, Eleanor decided she had to take matters into her own hands. She couldn't live in this limbo forever, unable to trust the man who had been her world. So she began to look for answers. The first place she turned was the house. Over the years, Eleanor had become intimately familiar with every nook and cranny. She knew Harold's habits better than her own, had memorized the places he kept his things, the bookcase by the window where his favorite novels rested, the old leather chair he always sank into after dinner, the drawer in the kitchen where he kept his reading glasses. But today she found herself searching for something else, something that had been hidden in plain sight, obscured by the normalcy of their life together. She started with Harold's study, the room where it had all begun. He had always been protective of that space, but Eleanor now felt a strange sense of entitlement. She needed to know more, to dig deeper. The letter had opened a door she couldn't close, and now she had to follow where it led. Eleanor didn't know what she was expecting to find, maybe another letter, maybe a forgotten note. But what she uncovered instead was a jumble of old photographs and mementos from their early years together. The study shelves, once so meticulously organized, were now a haphazard collection of time-worn boxes, yellowing papers, and faded envelopes. Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat as she began to sift through them, each object bringing back memories, some pleasant, others unsettling. There were photos of their wedding, family vacations, the birth of their children. But there, hidden beneath a stack of untouched files, was another envelope. This one addressed to Harold, written in the same delicate handwriting. Her pulse quickened. She opened it with trembling fingers, already knowing what she would find. Inside there was no letter this time, just a photograph. It was a picture of Harold and a woman, smiling in the sunlight, their faces close together, their eyes locked in a shared secret. It was an image that seemed so out of place, so foreign. Eleanor had never seen this woman before, but there was no mistaking the intimacy between them. Harold's arm was around her, his smile a little too bright, a little too comfortable. The woman's name was written on the back in faint pencil. Margaret. Eleanor's mind reeled. This photograph, this tangible piece of the past, was not something Harold had ever shared with her. She had never seen it before, never even suspected its existence, but now it felt as though she had stumbled upon a truth that had been buried for years. The connection between Harold and Margaret wasn't as casual as he had claimed. It was something more, a bond that had lasted beyond just a brief affair, something that had been kept hidden from her all these years. The weight of the discovery sank in, and Eleanor felt her stomach twist. How many other secrets had Harold kept from her? How many more memories of this woman were locked away, hidden behind a carefully constructed facade? She spent the next few days in a haze, her thoughts consumed by the discovery. She found herself questioning everything she had once taken for granted. The small moments she had shared with Harold now seemed tainted, as though they too were part of a bigger lie. There had been times when Harold had been distant, distracted. Those moments now seemed like glaring red flags she had ignored, believing that their marriage was beyond such petty concerns. But Eleanor couldn't ignore them any longer. The nagging doubt in her mind refused to be silenced. She tried to speak to Harold about it again, but he quickly shut her down. "Eleanor, please," he said, his voice growing more impatient with each passing day. "I've told you everything you need to know. It was a long time ago, and it's over. Can't we just move on?" But moving on was no longer an option for Eleanor. The more Harold denied her, the more she searched for answers. She began looking through old journals, hoping to find a trace of this hidden part of his life. She scoured the house, looking for clues, for any sign of the truth. Every drawer she opened, every book she touched, seemed to offer her nothing but silence. As the days passed, Eleanor's paranoia grew. She couldn't shake the feeling that Harold was hiding more from her. His every word, his every glance seemed like an attempt to keep her in the dark. But the more he tried to dismiss her concerns, the more Eleanor dug into the corners of their life together, searching for the one thing that would make sense of it all. Late one night, after Harold had fallen asleep, Eleanor found herself standing in the doorway of his study once more, staring at the bookshelf that had once felt like a source of comfort. She had never realized how much she had relied on that certainty, that feeling of being secure in the life they had built. But now every book on the shelf seemed like a potential lie, a shadow of something Eleanor couldn't yet grasp. She reached for one of the volumes, her fingers brushing against the spine as though it might somehow reveal the truth she was seeking. The shadows of doubt had taken root in her heart, and now they were growing. The house was quiet, too quiet. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, the sound of the clock ticking louder than it had ever been. Her mind was a whirl of questions, each one more painful than the last. She hadn't expected to find all the answers in one moment, but she had hoped for something. A sign, a glimpse of honesty. Instead, Harold had become more distant, more elusive. The photograph of Margaret that she had uncovered seemed to linger like a shadow over everything. It wasn't just about the letter anymore. It was about a deeper betrayal, something she wasn't sure she could ever fully understand. That evening, when Harold returned from work, Eleanor knew she couldn't keep waiting for him to open up. She had tried to be patient, to allow him the space he claimed he needed. But patience was no longer an option. The silence between them had grown unbearable, and every moment she spent avoiding the conversation only made it worse. He stepped into the kitchen, his face a little drawn from the day's stresses. As usual, he greeted her with a forced smile. But Eleanor wasn't fooled. She could see the wariness in his eyes. the way his gaze darted to the side as if he was trying to figure out how to keep the peace without actually addressing what was happening. "Harold," she said, her voice steady, but the undercurrent of anger was unmistakable. "We need to talk." He froze for a moment, his hand still on the doorframe before he sighed and slowly entered the room. "Eleanor, I've already told you, there's nothing to talk about. It was a mistake and it's over." Eleanor's stomach churned. The words were always the same, so dismissive, so practiced. She had heard them 100 times, and each time they rang more hollow than the last. "No, Harold, you haven't told me everything. And I'm not going to let you keep pretending everything's fine." He ran a hand through his hair, clearly growing frustrated. "What do you want me to say? I've said it all before." "That's the problem, isn't it?" Eleanor's voice was quiet but sharp. "You keep saying it's over, that it was nothing. But the things I've found," her words caught in her throat and she forced herself to continue. "You're not being honest with me. About Margaret, about the years that I thought we shared together." Harold's face flushed, a mixture of guilt and annoyance creeping into his expression. "I'm not going to explain myself any further, Eleanor. It was a brief affair, it meant nothing, and I've apologized, haven't I? What more do you want?" Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. "I want the truth, Harold, all of it." He opened his mouth to retort but closed it again as if weighing his words. The silence between them felt suffocating, the air thick with the unsaid. Finally he spoke, his voice quieter now, reluctant. "What do you expect me to say? That it was something more? That it wasn't just an emotional connection? That it was a real affair? Is that what you want me to admit?" Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest. "Yes, I want you to admit that you lied to me, that you kept this from me for years. And I want to understand why." Harold's shoulders slumped and he stepped back, as though the weight of her words had physically drained him. "It wasn't about you, Eleanor," he said quietly. "It was about me. I was confused. I was searching for something I wasn't getting from our marriage. I made a mistake, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. It doesn't mean I don't regret it. You have to understand that." Eleanor shook her head, the tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know if I can understand that, Harold. You say it was a mistake, but how do I know it's the only one? How many other things have you hidden from me? How many other lies have you told?" Harold opened his mouth as though to say something, but no words came. He seemed to shrink before her, the confidence he had once carried so effortlessly slipping away like sand through his fingers. "I've been so blind," Eleanor whispered, her voice cracking as the truth of it all settled in. "For years I've been so sure of everything, of us, and now I don't know what's real anymore." There was a long pause, the tension between them thick with unspoken truths. Finally Harold spoke, his voice low and strained. "I don't have all the answers, Eleanor. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm trying. I want to try, but you have to meet me halfway. You have to trust me again." Eleanor's mind was racing, her thoughts scattered and fragmented. She wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the idea that their marriage could somehow survive this, but the hurt was too raw, too real. She had spent so many years trusting Harold without question, without hesitation. And now everything felt like a lie. Her gaze drifted to the photograph of Margaret still tucked away in her mind, the image of Harold with another woman so intimate, so personal. She could still feel the weight of it in her chest. "I don't know if I can do that, Harold," Eleanor said softly, the words more of a confession than a statement. "I don't know if I can trust you again." The words hung in the air between them, a chasm too wide to bridge. Harold stood there, silent, his face a mixture of frustration and sorrow. "Is that it then?" he asked quietly. "Is this the end?" Eleanor didn't know how to answer. Part of her wanted to scream, to demand that he make it right, to beg him to fight for her, for them. But another part of her, the part that had seen too many lies and felt too much pain, knew that trust was not something easily repaired. It wasn't something she could simply wish back into existence. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I need time, Harold. I need time to figure out what I'm supposed to do with all of this." He nodded, the deep lines on his face betraying his own uncertainty. "I'll give you time," he said softly, "but I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as it takes." Eleanor wasn't sure if she believed him. She wasn't sure about anything anymore. All she knew was that the world she had once known was slipping through her fingers, and she didn't know if she could catch it before it all fell apart. The following days passed in a blur of silence. Eleanor had expected the weight of Harold's confession to lift some of the heaviness that had settled between them, but it only seemed to add another layer of uncertainty. The air in their home felt thick with unsaid words, and every glance exchanged between them was laden with too many things left unresolved. Eleanor had always prided herself on being a woman who trusted her instincts. She had trusted Harold for over 30 years, never once questioning the foundation of their marriage. But now, with each passing day, her instincts felt sharper, more like an itch she couldn't scratch. The letter she had found, the one from Margaret, had only opened a door she couldn't shut. There were too many pieces missing from the puzzle, too many things she needed to understand before she could decide whether she could stay or if it was time to walk away. It had been a week since her conversation with Harold, and Eleanor found herself in his study again, her fingers brushing over the worn spines of the bookshelves, trying to find something, anything that could explain the man she had spent her life with. The study had once been a sanctuary for Harold, a place where he could retreat to read, to write, to think. It had always been a space she respected, never daring to intrude too much into his private world. But now it felt like a minefield. Her eyes landed on the old photograph albums that had been tucked away on the bottom shelf. They were the kind Harold had never been willing to part with. The ones filled with pictures from his youth, his early days with Eleanor. She had never been one to rummage through his personal history, preferring to let the past stay where it belonged, in the past. But now that past was the only thing that could give her the answers she needed. Eleanor sat at the desk and carefully pulled out the first album. The faded leather binding cracked under her fingers as she flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the pictures of Harold with friends, with family, and inevitably with Margaret. There, in a snapshot taken in the 1980s, was the woman Eleanor had heard so much about, standing beside Harold, smiling in a way that made Eleanor's stomach twist. Margaret wasn't just a passing acquaintance. She was someone who had been there, part of their world long before Eleanor had ever known about her. There she was, younger but unmistakable, her dark eyes sparkling with a mischievous light, her long hair cascading over her shoulders in loose waves. The photograph was taken at a party, some kind of celebration, and Harold's arm was draped casually around Margaret's waist. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just a moment of friendly camaraderie. There was a closeness between them, an intimacy that Eleanor hadn't noticed before. The look in their eyes suggested something more than friendship. Eleanor turned the page, feeling the sudden weight of each photograph. Each one was a glimpse into a life she hadn't been a part of, a life that had unfolded without her knowledge. It was a sharp reminder of how much of Harold's history had remained hidden from her, and how easily it could have continued to remain that way if she hadn't stumbled across that letter. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to stave off the headache that was building. The past felt like a labyrinth, and each new piece she uncovered seemed to pull her deeper into the mystery of Harold's betrayal. Margaret wasn't just a passing affair, a mistake as Harold had claimed. She was someone who had been entwined in their lives for decades, a secret that had taken root long before Eleanor ever knew about it. It was clear now that Harold had never fully severed his ties to Margaret. But why? What was it that had kept him coming back to her, even when Eleanor thought their marriage was solid? And what had Margaret meant to him, really? Was it just an emotional connection, as Harold had insisted, or had there been something more? Eleanor knew she couldn't move forward without more answers. She needed to know who Margaret really was, what her relationship with Harold had truly been like, and most importantly, she needed to know why Harold had kept this part of his life hidden from her for so long. The next day, Eleanor did something she hadn't ever considered before. She reached out to Margaret. The woman she had never met, the woman whose presence had shadowed her marriage for years, was now someone Eleanor felt she had to confront. It was a desperate decision, but Eleanor wasn't sure what else to do. She had to hear it from Margaret herself, had to see if the woman's story matched Harold's. She found Margaret's phone number in one of the old letters Harold had tucked away in a drawer, his handwriting on the envelope unmistakable. The idea of calling Margaret felt surreal, but Eleanor couldn't back out now. She needed answers, and she had come too far to turn back. The phone rang only once before a soft voice answered. "Hello, is this Margaret?" Eleanor asked, her heart racing in her chest. There was a slight pause before the woman replied, "Yes, this is Margaret. Who is this?" "My name is Eleanor," she said, trying to steady her voice. I'm Harold's wife." Another pause. Eleanor could hear the hesitation in Margaret's voice, and it only made her more certain that this conversation was long overdue. "Harold's wife," Margaret repeated, her tone soft but measured. "What is this about?" Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts. "I need to talk to you. About the past. About you and Harold." There was a slight shift in the silence on the other end of the line. "I'm not sure what you want from me, Eleanor," Margaret said, her voice almost apologetic. "But I can't change what happened. I never meant to hurt you." Eleanor's stomach tightened at the words. "I don't know if I can forgive Harold," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "but I need to understand. I need to know the truth." Margaret's voice softened further, and Eleanor could hear the faintest hint of sadness. "I never meant for any of this to hurt you, but I'm not the one who kept secrets. Harold has his reasons for everything, but he never shared them with you. He never shared the full story." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. "What happened between you two?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret sighed, the sound filled with years of emotion, of stories untold. It wasn't as simple as Harold might say. It wasn't just some fling or a mistake. But it wasn't an affair in the way you might think either. It was something we both needed at the time, a connection we didn't know how to let go of. Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. "And what about me? What about our life together?" Margaret was silent for a long moment. Then softly she said, "I'm sorry, Eleanor. I didn't mean to hurt you, but sometimes the heart wants what the heart wants." Eleanor's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Margaret's words were a painful reminder that love wasn't always as simple as loyalty and trust. It was complicated, messy, and often beyond anyone's control. As Eleanor ended the conversation, she realized that her search for answers was only just beginning. What had happened between Harold and Margaret was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, one she wasn't sure she was ready to solve. Eleanor didn't know what had compelled her to call Margaret in the first place. But now, as she prepared for the trip to meet the woman who had been entangled in her life for decades, she felt a growing sense of dread. She had imagined what it might be like, what Margaret might look like, how she might speak, what she might reveal. But now that it was becoming a reality, Eleanor's emotions were more tangled than ever. The drive to Margaret's home was long, winding through quiet country roads and small towns that seemed almost too serene to contain any kind of secret. Eleanor felt like an intruder, an outsider. This was a world that had existed alongside her own for so many years without her ever knowing, and now it felt like that world was about to collide with hers in ways she couldn't predict. Margaret's home was a small, modest cottage on the outskirts of a town Eleanor had never heard of. The garden was neat but unremarkable, and the house itself, while well-maintained, had an air of quiet isolation. There was no sign of the woman who had been a ghost in Eleanor's life for so long. And yet there was something about the place that felt heavy with untold stories. Eleanor parked in front of the cottage, her hands gripping the steering wheel as her nerves surged. She had never been good at confrontation, had never been one to seek out uncomfortable truths, but now that was all she could do. She had to face Margaret, had to hear the rest of the story. When Margaret opened the door, Eleanor was struck by how much older she seemed than in the photograph. Time had done its work, and the years had etched deep lines into Margaret's face. But there was something familiar about her presence, a quiet strength that reminded Eleanor of herself. They stood there for a moment, both uncertain of how to proceed, until Margaret finally stepped aside and gestured for Eleanor to enter. "Come in," Margaret said, her voice gentle, though there was a hint of caution in it. "I wasn't sure you'd actually come." Eleanor nodded, stepping into the dimly lit living room. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood, and there was a sense of calm that almost made Eleanor feel like she was in another world, one that was not burdened with the weight of deceit and betrayal. "I wasn't sure I'd come either," Eleanor replied, forcing a small smile as she sat on the couch. Margaret moved to the chair across from her, sitting down slowly, almost as if she were bracing herself for what was to come. They were silent for a moment, both women trying to find the right words. Finally, Margaret spoke. "You must have a lot of questions," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Eleanor nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I don't even know where to start." Margaret sighed and leaned forward slightly, her hands folded in her lap. "I don't know if I can give you all the answers you're looking for, but I'll try." Eleanor shifted in her seat, the weight of the moment settling over her like a thick blanket. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted. "Harold says it was just an emotional connection, but I'm not sure if I believe him." Margaret's eyes flickered with something, maybe regret, maybe guilt, but she didn't look away. It wasn't just an affair, not in the traditional sense. Harold and I, we had a deep bond, one that neither of us expected. It wasn't about physical attraction or anything like that. It was more about companionship, something we both needed at the time. Eleanor's stomach churned as she processed the words. This wasn't what she had expected to hear. She had thought it was going to be some sordid tale, some confession of a passionate affair. But Margaret's tone was calm, almost matter-of-fact, as though the emotional connection they shared had simply been a natural consequence of their lives intertwining. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "Why didn't Harold ever tell me about you? Why did he keep it a secret for so long?" Margaret shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. "Harold's a complicated man," she said carefully. "He's always been someone who struggles with his emotions. He's not good at talking about the things that matter. And I think he thought if he just kept it all in the past, you wouldn't have to know." "But I had to know, Margaret," Eleanor said, her voice rising, frustration bubbling up inside her. "We've been married for over 30 years. 30 years, and he's been hiding this from me all along. All these years I thought we were happy, that we were enough, and now I find out that I was just the other woman in his eyes. How could he do that to me?" Margaret looked down, her expression softening, as if she could understand the pain Eleanor was feeling, even if she couldn't completely comprehend it. "Eleanor, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to come between you and Harold, but sometimes people get lost. Sometimes they find someone who understands them in ways they never thought possible. It wasn't that Harold didn't love you. It was that he was seeking something he couldn't find in his own life. Something that," she paused and swallowed, "something that made him feel alive again." Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, each word cutting deeper than the last. "And what about you, Margaret? What did you want out of all this? Was I just a shadow in your life too?" Margaret's gaze faltered, and for the first time Eleanor saw something like shame flicker in her eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you, Eleanor. I never thought it would get this far. It was a long time ago, and I thought it was over. But I was wrong. I should have told you sooner, and I should have let Harold go long before now, but sometimes we all make mistakes, don't we?" The silence between them hung heavy, and Eleanor could feel the weight of the years pressing down on her. The years of her life, of her marriage, all now tainted by the revelation that the man she had trusted most had lived a double life, one that had been hidden from her in ways she could never have imagined. "So what now?" Eleanor asked quietly, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" Margaret didn't have an answer, and neither did Eleanor. There was no simple solution, no clear path forward. They were both left in the wake of a relationship that had unraveled before them, and all they had now was the truth. A truth that neither of them had expected to find and neither of them knew how to process. As Eleanor stood to leave, she felt no sense of resolution, only an overwhelming sense of emptiness. Margaret's story had answered some of her questions, but it had only opened up new ones. And now she would have to face Harold once again, to ask him the questions she had been too afraid to ask before, knowing that no matter what he said, nothing would ever be the same again. Eleanor returned home that afternoon with a heavy heart, her mind whirling with everything Margaret had said. The conversation had been unsettling, to say the least. She had hoped for clarity, for some sense of resolution, but instead she had walked away feeling more confused than ever. Margaret had seemed sincere, almost apologetic, but that only made Eleanor question her own understanding of the situation. Was Margaret really just a victim in all this, or was she playing her part in a much more complicated drama? The drive home was agonizing. Every mile felt like it added to the weight pressing down on her chest. The familiar landscape blurred as Eleanor's thoughts consumed her. What did it all mean? How could Harold have allowed this to happen? And more importantly, why had he never told her? As she walked through the front door, the house felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. The walls, once filled with memories of shared moments and laughter, now felt like a cage. Eleanor's footsteps echoed through the hallway as she made her way to the study, where she knew Harold would be, as always, in his favorite chair by the window. He was reading, as if nothing had changed, as if they hadn't just crossed a line that neither of them could ever erase. "Harold," Eleanor said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge of anger she couldn't hide. "We need to talk." He looked up from his book, startled but not surprised. He had known this conversation was coming. He had known that the silence between them wasn't enough to keep the truth buried forever. His face was unreadable as he set his book aside, his posture stiffening. "About what?" he asked, his voice too calm, too distant for Eleanor's liking. "You know what?" she snapped, her patience thinning. She stepped closer to him, her eyes locking with his, searching for any hint of remorse or guilt. But he was as impenetrable as ever, his expression unreadable. "I spoke with Margaret today." The words hung between them like a storm cloud, thick and suffocating. Harold's face shifted ever so slightly, a faint flicker of something, maybe panic, maybe guilt, crossing his features before it was quickly masked. He didn't speak at first, and Eleanor took a step closer, her heart racing. "And what did she tell you?" he asked, his voice almost too soft, like he was trying to defuse a bomb before it exploded. "She's probably filled your head with all sorts of nonsense." "Nonsense," Eleanor repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "Is that what you think, that she's just making things up?" Harold stood, suddenly tense, and began pacing in front of her. "You don't understand, Eleanor. It was a long time ago. A stupid mistake, something that should have stayed in the past, a mistake." Eleanor's voice rose, the words bursting out before she could stop them. "That's what you call it? You hid it for decades, Harold. And you expect me to just forgive you because it was a mistake? Please, Eleanor," he pleaded, his tone shifting, becoming defensive. "Don't make this worse than it already is. I never meant for you to find out. It was nothing more than an emotional connection. That's all it ever was. An emotional connection," Eleanor repeated, disbelief in her voice. "What does that even mean, Harold? What does it mean when you share something so personal, so deep with someone else? You don't just connect with someone emotionally and then forget about it. You don't spend all those hours talking to her and pretend it means nothing." "I never meant to hurt you," Harold said, his voice lower now, tinged with frustration. "I didn't know how to tell you. I didn't know how to make it right, and I thought if I just kept it buried it would all go away." "Well, it didn't go away, did it, Harold?" Eleanor said, her voice rising again. "Because now I know. And now everything I thought I knew about us, about our life, is shattered. You've kept me in the dark for years. And for what? So you could have a secret life, a life where you felt something for someone else." Harold was silent for a long moment, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of her words had finally begun to sink in. When he spoke again, it was softer, almost pleading. "I never stopped loving you, Eleanor. You've always been the most important person in my life. But I made a mistake, a foolish mistake, and now I see the damage it's done." "You see the damage," Eleanor repeated, her voice trembling. "You see it now, after all these years, after all the lies, the secrets, the silences. You see it now." Harold closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as though trying to ward off the weight of the truth. "I don't know what you want from me, Eleanor. I've apologized. I've told you it wasn't what you think. What more do you want?" "I want the truth, Harold," she said, her voice breaking. "I want to understand why. Why her? Why not me? Why didn't you come to me? You've spent all these years keeping things from me, from us. And I need to know why you never thought I was enough." For a long time there was only silence between them, thick and oppressive. Eleanor stood there, shaking, as Harold remained silent, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I never meant to hurt you," Harold said again, but this time there was no conviction in his voice, just resignation. "And yet you did," Eleanor whispered. Her heart felt heavy with the weight of his words, and for the first time, she realized just how deep the wound had gone. It wasn't just about Margaret. It was about trust, about a bond that had been broken in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. "You've betrayed me, Harold," she said, the words finally coming out with a clarity she hadn't had before, "and I'm not sure I can forgive you for that." She turned away, walking toward the door without another word. Harold didn't try to stop her. He simply stood there, his face a mask of sorrow and regret. Eleanor left the study, her mind spinning with the realization that everything had changed. She had confronted Harold, and he had confessed, but that didn't change the fact that she had been living in the shadow of a lie for so long. As she stepped out of the house and into the night, she felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The man she had loved, the man she had built her life with, was someone she didn't fully understand anymore. And now she had a choice to make. Would she stay and try to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, or would she walk away from a marriage that had already begun to unravel? The weeks following the confrontation with Harold felt like an eternity. Eleanor moved through her days in a fog of confusion and anger, her emotions vacillating between grief, disbelief, and a deep sense of betrayal. The house, once a sanctuary of shared memories, now felt like a battleground. She couldn't walk through a single room without feeling the weight of what had been exposed. Harold seemed to shrink into himself. His attempts to bridge the gap between them, to show remorse, were half-hearted at best. He would try to talk to her, to apologize again, but each time Eleanor felt more distant, more closed off. He had told her he was sorry, over and over again, but sorry wasn't enough. The damage had already been done, and no number of apologies could erase the reality of what he had kept hidden for so many years. At night, Eleanor found herself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing. What had their marriage been all these years? Was it always this fragile? The comfortable rhythms of their life had now become a reminder of all the secrets he'd kept from her. Secrets that now hung like a dark cloud over every conversation, every glance. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was living with a stranger, a man whose true self had been concealed from her for decades. In the mornings, they went through the motions of a normal day. Eleanor would make breakfast, and Harold would sit at the table, occasionally offering a weak smile or a half-hearted attempt at small talk. But the air between them was thick with unspoken words, and neither could ignore the gulf that had opened up between them. Their interactions had become strained, devoid of the affection and intimacy they once shared. Even their shared meals, once a comforting ritual, felt awkward, Eleanor would pick at her food, trying to focus on anything other than the man sitting across from her. Harold, too, seemed to withdraw, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The connection they had once shared, so natural and effortless, was now lost to them, buried under layers of hurt and distrust. Eleanor had tried to focus on the mundane, on keeping the house running, on maintaining a semblance of normalcy for the sake of their children, who would occasionally visit. But even their presence didn't seem to make things better. When the children came over for a family dinner, Eleanor could see the concern in their eyes, the awkwardness in their smiles. They noticed the tension, the coldness that had replaced the warmth of years past. And while they didn't ask directly, Eleanor knew they could feel the cracks in the foundation of the family. "Mom, are you okay?" their daughter Laura had asked one evening after dinner, her voice soft as if unsure whether to bring up the elephant in the room. "You've been kind of quiet lately." Eleanor had smiled, but it was a sad, tired smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart," she had lied, her voice betraying her. "Just tired." Laura looked at her mother with a mixture of concern and confusion. "Is it about Dad?" Eleanor didn't know how to respond. The words seemed to catch in her throat. How could she explain to her daughter that her father, the man they had all trusted, had betrayed them in ways they couldn't even begin to understand? How could she make sense of it for herself, let alone for her children? She shook her head, her gaze drifting to Harold, who was silently clearing the table, his movements mechanical. "Your father and I are just working through some things," she said. Though the words felt hollow even as they left her lips, she didn't know how to make her family understand what had happened, how to make them see that the woman they had known as strong, as steadfast, was now lost in a sea of uncertainty. That night, after the children had gone home, Eleanor retreated to her study. She sat at the desk, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her, and tried to focus on anything that could give her some semblance of peace. But there was no escape from the reality of her situation. Her mind kept returning to the same question: what was the point of it all? What was she supposed to do with a marriage that had been fractured beyond repair? She looked over at Harold, who had been sitting in the living room, staring out the window into the darkened garden. He was lost in thought, his face a mask of guilt and regret, and for a moment Eleanor felt a pang of sympathy for him. But then it was quickly replaced by something darker. How could she still feel sorry for him when he had been the one to tear their life apart? The next morning, Eleanor didn't bother with breakfast. She dressed quickly, ignoring Harold's silent attempts at conversation. She had made up her mind. She needed space, needed time to think. She couldn't keep living in the same house with him, pretending everything was normal when it was anything but. "I'm going out for a while," she said, her voice distant and flat. Harold looked up, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Where are you going?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor replied, her eyes not meeting his. "Just away from here." With that, she grabbed her keys and left the house, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that sent a shiver through her. She drove aimlessly, not caring where the road took her. Her mind was racing, but all she could think about was the growing divide between them, the gulf that seemed to widen every day. She found herself parked in a small cafe by the lake, a place she used to visit years ago when she needed time to think. It was quiet there, the soft sound of water lapping against the shore providing a gentle background to the chaos in her mind. She sat at a table by the window, staring out at the water, unsure of what to do next. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Mabel. "Are you okay? I'm worried about you. Call me when you can." Eleanor stared at the message for a moment, torn. She hadn't spoken to Mabel in days. They had been friends for over 20 years, and Mabel had always been a voice of reason, someone who could offer perspective when things felt out of control. But Eleanor wasn't sure she was ready to talk, not yet. Not until she could make sense of the mess she was living in. As she sat there, watching the water ripple in the distance, Eleanor realized something. Her life was no longer about just surviving. It was about figuring out who she was without Harold, without the life they had built together. The marriage that had once been her everything was now a fragile shell, and she didn't know if it was worth saving. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time Eleanor realized she had a choice. She could keep living in the shadow of the man who had betrayed her, or she could start building a new life for herself, one that didn't revolve around the man who had broken her trust. She wasn't sure what the answer was yet, but she knew she had to start finding it. Eleanor's life had become a delicate balance between maintaining appearances and battling the storm within. Her world, once centered around Harold, now felt like a delicate house of cards, and with each passing day, she wondered how much longer she could keep it from collapsing. The decision to separate emotionally, if not physically, was no longer a matter of if but when. The question now was how to navigate the uncertain waters ahead without losing herself entirely. Therapy was something she had always considered but never seriously entertained. It seemed indulgent, perhaps, for someone like her, someone who had always prided herself on her self-sufficiency, who had built a life with Harold and raised children, managing with little more than grit and determination. But now, with Harold's betrayal hanging over her like a constant shadow, Eleanor realized that she needed help. The first few sessions had been difficult. She felt vulnerable, like she was exposing parts of herself she had long kept hidden, even from herself. The therapist, a calm, composed woman named Dr. Roberts, asked her questions that dug into the heart of her pain. "What did you hope to find when you married Harold?" she had asked in their second session. At the time, Eleanor had choked on her words, struggling to articulate the hopes and dreams that had seemed so clear years ago. She had married Harold because she believed in the life they would build together, because she wanted to be part of something larger than herself. Their marriage had always seemed like a shared project, a mutual commitment to creating a life rich in love, laughter, and security. But now that vision felt so distant, so impossible. It had all been built on a foundation of half-truths and hidden emotions, and Eleanor felt like a fool for ever believing in it so completely. But Dr. Roberts's gentle probing helped Eleanor begin to sift through her emotions. She was angry, yes, but more than that, she was heartbroken. She felt like she had given up parts of herself for the sake of Harold and their family, only to be betrayed by the one person she thought would always be her anchor. That realization, admitting to herself how much of her identity had been defined by her role as Harold's wife, was a hard pill to swallow. It was during one of these sessions that Dr. Roberts suggested Eleanor try something outside of therapy to help her reconnect with herself. A writing group. At first, Eleanor had dismissed the idea. Writing? She wasn't a writer. She hadn't written anything more than grocery lists in years. But Dr. Roberts insisted, explaining that creative expression could be an effective way to work through emotions and re-establish a sense of personal agency. Skeptical but willing to try anything, Eleanor found herself at the community center a week later, standing at the door of a small, modest room where a group of strangers sat around a table. The leader, a woman in her early 50s with kind eyes and a warm smile, introduced herself as Claire and welcomed Eleanor with open arms. The group, made up of people from various walks of life, all seemed eager to share their stories and thoughts with one another. Eleanor felt out of place at first, like a visitor in a strange land. But when Claire asked everyone to introduce themselves and share a brief story, something inside Eleanor shifted. She hesitated at first, unsure of what to say, but then she began to speak. She told them about her life with Harold, the marriage, the family, the years of shared experiences. She didn't go into the details of the betrayal, but something in her story resonated with the others. As she spoke, Eleanor began to realize just how much of herself she had neglected. In her role as a wife and mother, she had allowed her personal desires and dreams to be overshadowed by the needs of the people around her. She had buried parts of herself for so long that she wasn't sure where Eleanor ended and the roles of wife and mother began. The group listened, offering quiet support. When Eleanor finished, Claire spoke up. "That was beautiful, Eleanor. You've lived so much, but now it's time to find out who you are beyond all of that. You deserve to feel like you're living for yourself too." The words struck Eleanor like a bolt of lightning. She hadn't realized how deeply she had buried her own needs until that moment. As she drove home that evening, she thought about the people she had once been. The young woman full of ambition and dreams. The adventurous spirit who had once believed in the possibility of change. She had spent so many years caring for others that she had forgotten how to care for herself. Over the next few weeks, Eleanor began to make small changes. She enrolled in a creative writing class at the local library, something she had always wanted to do but never had the time for. She started journaling daily, pouring her thoughts and emotions onto the page in an effort to make sense of her turmoil. Each evening, as she sat in her study, the pen moving fluidly across the paper, she felt a sense of clarity returning to her. Writing allowed her to express herself in ways she had never been able to before. It was cathartic, liberating. And then, in one of those late-night journaling sessions, she wrote something that stopped her cold. "Who am I without Harold? Who am I without my marriage?" The words seemed to echo in the silence of the room. Eleanor had spent so many years defining herself through her relationship with Harold that she had forgotten what it meant to just be Eleanor. But the more she wrote, the more she realized that the answer wasn't as terrifying as she once thought. She was still her, strong, resilient, capable of growth. She didn't need Harold to define her worth. The next step was more difficult. Eleanor knew she had to start reasserting herself in her own life. The phone calls with friends became more frequent as she reconnected with those she had distanced herself from over the years. She rejoined a book club she had once been a part of, and slowly she began to reclaim her independence. The more Eleanor focused on herself, the more she realized just how much she had neglected her own growth. She had become so consumed with being a wife, a mother, a caretaker, that she had abandoned the things that made her unique. But now, in the aftermath of the storm that had wrecked her marriage, she was beginning to find herself again. It wasn't easy. There were still moments of sadness, moments where she felt the weight of her choices and the emotional toll of her marriage. But there was also a growing sense of hope, a flicker of possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could build a new future for herself, one that was hers alone. Eleanor's path was no longer about salvaging her marriage or trying to force things to go back to the way they were. It was about discovering who she was without the shadow of her past. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that she was worthy of happiness. Whether or not Harold was part of it, Eleanor sat in the quiet solitude of the kitchen, the soft morning light filtering through the window and casting a warm glow across the room. She absent-mindedly stirred her coffee, the rhythmic motion providing a sense of calm, yet her mind was far from peaceful. It had been weeks since Harold's health scare, and the weight of their situation felt heavier now than it had ever been. He had suffered a minor stroke, a warning, one that had left him weak and vulnerable. At first, Eleanor had been consumed by concern. She had stayed by his side in the hospital, held his hand during the long quiet nights, and made decisions with a level of care she hadn't known she was capable of. The shock of his vulnerability had unsettled her, pushing all the bitterness of his betrayal to the back of her mind. For a brief moment she wondered if this was a sign, a second chance at their life together, a life she had once imagined so full of possibility. But as Harold's health slowly improved, so did the distance between them. His recovery had been slow, and though he had regained much of his strength, Eleanor could no longer ignore the chasm that had formed between them. The cracks in their marriage had always been there, hidden beneath years of shared routines and unspoken expectations. But now they felt unbridgeable. The betrayal, once a jagged wound, was still fresh in her heart, and no amount of caring for him in his vulnerable state could make it go away. Harold, in his usual way, had withdrawn into himself. He was quieter than ever, his moments of affection more forced than natural, and though he insisted he was doing everything in his power to regain her trust, his actions spoke volumes. He was trying, but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough because Eleanor had changed. There were days when she saw glimpses of the man she had once loved so deeply, the man who had made her laugh, who had held her hand through the hardships of raising their children, the man who had promised her forever. Those memories, however, felt distant now, like echoes of a life that no longer existed. The weight of the present was too much, too suffocating. Eleanor could no longer deny the truth. She was not the same person who had married Harold all those years ago. And so, in the stillness of that morning, as the sun rose higher and the house began to stir with the sounds of life, Eleanor found herself at a crossroads. The decision she had been avoiding for months now loomed over her, pressing her with all the gravity of a final reckoning. Should she stay and try to rebuild the shattered remains of their marriage? Or was it time to let go, to face the reality that the life she had once known had come to an end? Harold had noticed the shift in her. He had grown more attentive since his stroke, aware of the growing distance between them. He had even taken to doing small things, buying her favorite flowers, preparing dinner on nights when she was busy with work, yet none of it felt genuine. It was as though he was trying to undo the damage with gestures, but the damage wasn't something that could be fixed with kindness alone. The foundation of their relationship had crumbled, and no amount of outward effort could repair what was broken inside. But Eleanor couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt. The kids had been upset about the strain in the house, and part of her wondered whether she was being too harsh, too unforgiving. Could they truly move forward from this? Could Harold change? Could she forgive him and rebuild their life together? The idea of starting over felt daunting, but the idea of staying and pretending everything was fine felt even worse. That afternoon, Harold asked her to sit with him in the living room. There was a nervousness to his voice that she hadn't heard in months, perhaps since before the affair had come to light. "I know you've been thinking about this," he said softly, looking at her with eyes that seemed to plead for her to understand. "I know that things between us aren't the same, and I don't blame you for being distant, but I need you to know that I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Eleanor. I can't change the past, but I want to change the future with you. Please, let's try again, for us, for what we had." Eleanor listened quietly, her heart pounding in her chest. His words were familiar, and yet they felt like hollow promises, the same words she had heard countless times before, each time more desperate than the last. It wasn't that she didn't care about him, she did, more than she could ever articulate. But she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that perhaps it was too late. Perhaps the damage was too great, and all that remained was the painful process of entangling their lives. In the weeks since the health scare, Eleanor had been grappling with the decision in her own way. She had spent more time away from Harold, reconnecting with her own life, her own friends. The therapy sessions had helped, and she had grown more confident in her ability to navigate the uncertainty of her future. Slowly but surely, she had begun to understand something that had eluded her for so long. She was not defined by her marriage to Harold. She was Eleanor, a woman capable of great love, but also of great strength. She had her own desires, her own needs, and those were not secondary to the life they had built together. But the pull of history, the weight of their shared years was not easy to escape. The memories of their children's birthdays, their vacations, their quiet nights at home, these were all things Eleanor cherished deeply. Letting go of that history felt like an enormous loss. It was as if she would be giving up a part of herself that had existed for decades. And then there was the reality of Harold's health. His recent health scare had shaken her, made her realize how fragile life was and how unpredictable the future could be. The idea of leaving him now when he was still recovering felt cruel. But at the same time, staying for the sake of staying felt equally unfair. Was she holding on to the past, to the memory of who they were, when the truth was that they were no longer the same people? The choice was hers to make, but neither option seemed easy. That evening, after Harold had gone to bed, Eleanor sat alone in the dimly lit living room, staring at the framed photograph on the mantel of their wedding day. The faces looking back at her seemed so young, so full of promise, as though nothing could stand in the way of the future they had dreamed of. She had loved him then. She had believed in their forever. But now, as she studied the image, Eleanor realized that the future they had dreamed of no longer existed. The question wasn't whether she could forgive Harold or forget the betrayal. It was whether she could ever truly trust him again, and whether she still had a place in her heart for the life they had once built. Tomorrow, she would make her decision. But tonight she was still uncertain. The morning light had a softness to it that Eleanor hadn't noticed in years. It gently poured through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor and illuminating the stillness of the house. For the first time in weeks, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, a cup of tea warming her hands, her gaze drifting over the room as memories from the past few months flickered through her mind. The confrontation with Harold, the painful admissions, the betrayal that had ripped through their lives like a storm, each moment felt distant now, as though it belonged to another life, another version of herself, and yet the echoes of those events lingered, a constant reminder of the fragile state of their marriage. Over the past few weeks, Eleanor had grown accustomed to the quiet moments between them. They had found a rhythm in their new dynamic, a tentative peace that existed more in silence than in words. Harold had become more present, more considerate, but Eleanor knew better than to believe that his efforts could erase the past. He had betrayed her trust, and no amount of flowers or quiet gestures could undo the damage. But despite everything, Eleanor had found something she hadn't expected. A sense of clarity. She had spent months sorting through her emotions, peeling back layers of resentment, disappointment, and fear. The therapy had helped, and so had her writing group. For the first time in a long while, she had learned to reconnect with herself. Her wants, her needs, her desires. She had rediscovered a part of her that was independent of Harold and their marriage. And that knowledge had brought her peace in its own way. Eleanor had also made peace with the idea that she didn't have to have all the answers right away. There was no sudden moment of epiphany, no grand declaration that would solve everything. But she had come to realize that life, love, marriage, forgiveness, wasn't always about dramatic choices. Sometimes it was about the small steps, the quiet moments where healing could happen. Slowly, over time, trust could be rebuilt, but it wouldn't be instantaneous. It couldn't be rushed. And so when Harold entered the kitchen, his face drawn from another long night of restlessness, Eleanor looked at him with a softness she hadn't known she could still feel. He had been trying, she could see that. But was it enough? Could it ever be enough? "Morning," he said, his voice low, almost tentative. "Morning," she replied, her smile gentle but tired, as if she had said the word 1,000 times already. There was a pause, an unsaid conversation that lingered between them. Harold's eyes searched hers, as if looking for a sign, a clue about what was coming. Eleanor set her cup down on the counter, then turned to face him fully. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but calm, "about everything we've been through, everything that's happened." Harold's breath caught, and he took a step closer, his hands trembling slightly. She could see the hope in his eyes, the desperation to fix things, to make them right. But Eleanor knew that hope alone wasn't enough. There had to be something deeper. "Harold," she continued, her heart heavy but resolute, "I can't promise you that things will go back to the way they were. I can't pretend that nothing has changed." He flinched at her words, but she didn't look away. She had to say this. She had to be honest with herself, with him. "But I'm also not going to pretend that I don't care about you," she said quietly. "I don't know what the future holds, Harold. I don't know if we'll ever be able to return to what we had, or if I'll ever be able to forgive you completely for what happened, but I do know that I'm not ready to give up on us yet." His eyes filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "So, you'll stay." "I'm staying for now," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "But it has to be different. I have to see that you're committed to changing, to earning my trust again. And I have to be allowed the space to decide what I need, what I want." Harold nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with sincerity. "And I'll do whatever it takes, Eleanor. I'll prove to you that I'm worth the chance." Eleanor's heart softened, but she knew better than to believe words alone. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. But she was willing to try. She was willing to take those small steps toward healing, even if it meant walking a path she wasn't sure of. The road ahead would be difficult, but it was theirs to navigate. For now, they had each other. For now, they would find a way forward. As Eleanor stood there, watching Harold wipe his eyes, a strange sense of peace settled over her. This wasn't a perfect resolution. There were still so many unanswered questions, so much uncertainty. But it was a beginning, a fragile one, but a beginning nonetheless, and maybe that was enough. As we reach the end of this story, we see how, even in the most challenging times, the journey to healing and self-discovery can lead to new beginnings. Remember, no matter your age, it's never too late to reflect on your relationships, learn from the past, and make choices that bring you peace. Have you ever faced a moment in your life where you had to rebuild trust? What helped you find clarity during difficult times? Would you choose to forgive, or is some damage just too much to repair? If you found this story meaningful, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more thoughtful tales. And if you've ever faced similar struggles, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Your wisdom and experiences matter to us all. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.